Our next story is also about history and, well, a higher power. Ruth Ezell tonight tells the story of an institution that has served generations of St. Louisans.
Central Baptist Church has spent 2006 celebrating its 160th anniversary. It's one of St. Louis's oldest churches with a predominantly African-American congregation, and it has a distinguished history.
Central Baptist Church, which started out as the Second African Baptist Church, because we came out of First Baptist, which is, of course, the oldest church as far as African Americans are concerned in St. Louis. 23 members started a church.
This is the only photo known to exist of any of the church founders. Her name was Martha Ferguson. She was among the group of 23 free-born African Americans and slaves who broke away from First Baptist Church and began holding house-to-house prayer meetings. In March of 1846, they moved into their first house of worship, a hall adjoining the old Liberty Engine House at the corner of 3rd and Cherry Streets. Cherry is now called Dr. Martin Luther King Drive. The first pastor of what was then called the Second African Baptist Church was the Reverend Richard Sneathen. He served for just 1 year, but when he left the church it was debt-free and had $2,000 in its coffers.
The theology of the pastors as well as the members of the earlier church really helped to set the foundation and the groundwork for our being here today. They really had to believe that God was able to gap the deficits that were created because of the societal and economic influences at that time.
In 1851, Second Baptist had outgrown Liberty Hall, and officials set out to build their first church edifice. They bought land at 8th and Green Streets and finished construction the following year. If Green Street doesn't sound familiar, that's because it's now called Lucas. The church changed its name too, from Second Baptist to the 8th Street Baptist Church. During this period, the pastor was John Richard Anderson. Some believe it was Reverend Anderson who urged Dred Scott to go to court and try to win his freedom, reasoning that Scott had spent time with his owner in the free state of Illinois.
Harriet Scott was a member of the church. Her husband, Dred Scott, according to what I've gathered from history, he was Catholic. However, when the famous Dred Scott decision was in the process of making its way to the Supreme Court, Anderson, who was the second pastor of the church, was sort of like their spiritual advisor.
Reverend Anderson died shortly before all slaves in Missouri were emancipated. Like the pastor before him and all those who followed, Reverend Anderson's spiritual mission also encompassed the quest for civil, economic, and educational rights for African Americans. The church would move 2 more times before settling into its current complex on the 2800 block of Washington Avenue. On April 12, 1885, a dedication was held for a church at 23rd and Morgan Streets. It was purchased from the Central Methodist Episcopal Congregation. Once again, the new owners changed the name of their institution to Central Baptist Church. Central would remain here nearly 3 decades. One of the pastors who served under this roof was George Stevens. He was instrumental in securing both Sumner and Vashon High Schools for students of color. Reverend Stevens also led his flock into the next church facility. The year was 1913. Central purchased Pilgrim Congregational Church at Ewing in Washington. Almost 30 years after the congregation settled in, Thomas Elliott Huntley was installed as the 10th pastor. Thus began what is considered the golden age of Central Baptist.
Huntley was a classmate with Martin Luther King at Morehouse. When Dr. King came to St. Louis, one of the first places that he preached at was here.
Reverend Huntley made a point of introducing Dr. King to the Walkers, both of whom were relative newcomers to St. Louis from the South.
I guess he said, here come some country people here, I'm going to make them feel at home, and he did.
Everett Walker served as the church's superintendent of education during the Huntley era. The programs on Walker's watch included the Church on Wheels. Launched by Reverend Huntley in 1947, a bus owned by Central would park each Sunday in an underserved neighborhood. Here it's at the corner of Lucas and Beaumont. Sunday school would then be held on board for area children. Some of the St. Louis area's most prominent African Americans of the day were part of Central Baptist congregation. One was St. Louis educator Julia Davis. She established a fund at the public library to purchase literature by, for, and about people of color. A branch library in North St. Louis is named for her. An important financial milestone for the congregation took place in April of 1943 when a mortgage that had been hanging over the church for nearly 30 years was paid off. A mortgage burning ceremony was held to celebrate. Fatefully, flames would eventually destroy the beautiful structure that housed a thriving religious community. It happened the evening of March 6, 1971. Firefighters were called to the church and arrived to find flames roaring in the sanctuary and shooting through the roof.
About 10 o'clock that Saturday night, somebody called us and told us on the phone that the church is on fire and it's burning now. So Mom and I came down here. People were crying, of course. So I guess I didn't have sense enough to cry, but they were concerned about the church.
The break of day revealed the fire's devastating effects. Although much of the stone exterior remained standing, the roof was gone. The interior lay in ruins. What had not been reduced to charred debris was severely smoke and water damaged. Investigators said the cause of the fire was electrical.
The next day, Sunday, some people came from First Baptist Church. They came over there and invited us to come over to church with them. We were there and we worshiped with them for a while.
Restoring the church would be costly, so prominent clergymen of other denominations stepped up to help. Missouri's Episcopal Bishop, the Right Reverend George Cadogan, led a 15-member ecumenical committee whose goal was to raise $100,000 for Central Baptist. Unfortunately, appeals sent out to thousands of Protestant and Catholic churches across the state yielded only 1/10 of the needed amount. In the end, Dr. Augustus Phillips, a deacon and chairman of Central Baptist Board of Trustees, secured the lion's share of the funding. Among his accomplishments during his lifetime, Dr. Phillips was president and CEO of New Age Federal Savings and Loan, Missouri's first black-owned financial institution. Another Central member, William Edward Lee, Jr., was lead architect for the new church. Lee was one of the first African Americans to become a corporate member of the American Institute of Architects. On December 21, 1975, the congregation marched into its current sanctuary, built on the same spot as the one that burned. The street that borders the west side of Central Baptist Church is named in memory of Reverend Huntley. He served Central for 40 years, longer than any other pastor to date. As a torch has been passed down through the years, Central's mission to grow in faith and community service remains. The approach used in carrying out that mission, however, has changed.
And now it is preaching time.
Reverend Robert Scott is the 13th pastor of Central Baptist Church. He says unlike the days of the Civil Rights Movement, where people banded together in nonviolent protest, he aims to empower men and women to improve their communities as individual disciples. In the pulpit, Reverend Scott employs what he calls prophetic preaching.
For me, prophetic preaching is dealing with the ills of society, focusing on social injustices and economic injustices and human injustices that permeate and pervade our society in such a way that those that are oppressed and downtrodden feel like that they don't have anyone that speaks for them.
As the church moves forward, it has the blessing of the member who's been here longer than anyone.
I came under Pastor Reverend Stevens.
105-year-old Cliantha Glover joined Central in 1924.
Well, I like this pastor because he's young and have young ideas. But they all had something to offer.
The Walkers think so too. Like Mrs. Glover, they're with Central for the duration.
Pastor Scott has instilled it in all of us. This is not our church. This is God's church.